During the American Civil War, life as a POW was no picnic, and a big part of people's misery was the food. Whether you were scrounging for vermin in a Union prison on Lake Erie, or flat out starving in the infamous Andersonville prison in Georgia. But on occasion, there were glimmers of decent food to be had, like this mock apple pie that I'm making using a recipe from 1863. So thank you to Factor for sponsoring this video as we look at the meager foods of a Civil War prison. This time on Tasting History. Now before we start with our mock apple pie, I just wanted to thank everyone for watching Tasting History every Tuesday and subscribing, because the channel just hit 2.5 million subscribers, and yeah, who knew that there were so many food history lovers out there? Not I. So thank you for subscribing, for supporting the channel, for buying my book, the Tasting History Cookbook, and yeah, now on to some Civil War prison food. Not the best segue. But if there is one thing that pretty much everyone knows about prisons during the Civil War, it's that the food sucked, or was non-existent. And so when I was trying to figure out what dish I was going to make for this episode, I came across some roadblocks because I didn't want to give myself dysentery. Luckily, I did find out that if you were an officer in many of the prisons, the food wasn't that bad. For instance, at Fort Warren in Boston, Confederate Major Thomas Sparrow wrote a letter to his wife on December 8, 1861, saying that our closet is never without crackers, cheese, bologna, sausage, fruitcake, plain cake, coffee, tea. And on Johnson's Island, located in Lake Erie, just off of Sandusky, Ohio, they allowed Confederate prisoners, at least the officers, to get care packages from home. And there was one man, Lieutenant Colonel John Inzer of Alabama, who really took advantage of this, receiving in 1 month at least 3 different care packages from 3 different women. One of them included 6 pounds of sugar, 3 pounds coffee, 3 cans milk, 3 tomatoes, 1 box mustard, 3 papers pepper, 5 pounds butter, 20 pounds meal, and 25 pounds flour, ham, onions, dried fruit. I am not sure what papers pepper is. I tried to do some research and nothing came up. I'm wondering if pepper was sold in like paper sachets. Not entirely sure. Anyway, other boxes that he received included things like strawberries and cucumbers and different cakes and pies. And it is the pie mentioned that got me making some pie today. But as it was wartime and these care packages were coming from the home front, food was scarce, especially down south. And so I'm going to be making a recipe from an 1863 Confederate receipt book, a compilation of over 100 receipts adapted to the times. Apple pie without apples. To 1 small bowl of crackers that have been soaked until no hard parts remain, add 1 teaspoonful of tartaric acid, sweeten to your taste, add some butter, and a very little nutmeg. And you'll note that this is a very poorly written recipe, as are many historic recipes. There are very few measurements. There's no mention of any kind of crust, and it doesn't tell you how to cook it. Do you bake it? Is it done raw? It's probably not. It is probably baked, but it doesn't actually say that. So I am going to be also looking at some later mock apple pie recipes to fill in the gaps. So for this recipe, what you'll need is 1 teaspoon of tartaric acid, 1 cup or 200 grams of brown sugar, 2 tablespoons of butter, a half teaspoon of nutmeg, and some crackers, about enough to make 2 cups when crushed up. But what kind of crackers? Because crackers then are not like crackers now. Now there are later recipes, again from mock apple pie, that use Ritz crackers, but those recipes were put out during the Great Depression by Ritz crackers, and Ritz crackers did not exist at this time. So they were probably a much more plain cracker, similar to pilot bread or hardtack. But if you don't have any of that, you can also just use some club crackers. They'll probably taste better too. So break up your crackers and put them in a bowl and cover with water and let them sit until they soften. Mine took a couple hours, though club crackers take about 10 seconds. While they soften, whisk together the brown sugar, tartaric acid, and nutmeg, and add in the butter. So drain the crackers and give them a good mashing, and then add in the sugar mixture and mix. And that is all that the recipe actually says to do. So we gotta figure out what to do for a crust and how to bake it, how long to bake it. I don't know, it's gonna take some trial and error. And that is why, after a full day of cooking stuff like this, sometimes I just don't feel like cooking myself dinner, and so I reach for a meal from today's sponsor, Factor. Now, just like HelloFresh, Factor, who is owned by HelloFresh, delivers meals right to your door. But with Factor, they ain't no cooking to be done. They are chef-crafted, ready to eat, never frozen, takes 2 minutes to prepare them, and they're ready to go. They're really perfect when you just don't have any time in your schedule to do some cooking, because we are all so busy, or to bring to work. Now, of course, I work from home, and I still eat them here, but I used to take them into the office all the time. When I had an office job, like 3 or 4 days a week, I had a Factor meal. The delicious meal that I made today for lunch was a chicken piccata, a wonderful meal in only 2 minutes. So head over to factor75.com or just click the link in the description and use my code TASTINGHISTORY50 to get 50% off of your first order plus 20% off of your next month of orders. That is factor75.com using code TASTINGHISTORY50 for 50% off of your first order and 20% off of your next month of orders. And now, with your Factor meal deliciously eaten, you can move on to your crust. But what crust are we going to make? Well, luckily, this book did have several recipes for unorthodox crusts. The one I'm using is for potato crust. Boil 6 good-sized mealy potatoes and mash them fine. Add salt, a spoonful of butter, and 2 of water while they are hot. Then work in flour enough to make a paste to roll out. So not really your typical pie dough, and there are lots of atypical recipes in this little book, including one for artificial oysters, which are made with green corn, and one that always kind of makes me laugh whenever I see it. It is a recipe for nice buns. Anyway, for your potato crust, what you'll need is 6 russet potatoes, 1½ teaspoons of salt, 1 tablespoon of butter, 2 tablespoons of water, and about a cup or 120 grams of flour. So first, peel the potatoes and cut them into quarters or eighths, and then set them in a large pot with water enough to cover them and bring the pot to a boil. Boil gently for about 20 minutes or until they're very soft. Then drain the potatoes and return them to the pot and mash them up as smooth as you can. Now while they're still hot, you can add the salt, the butter, and the water and mix. Then start adding flour just a little at a time, mixing until the potatoes come together to form something like a dough. This is not going to be a roll out kind of dough. It just isn't. If you make it and you can figure out how to make it like a rollable dough, let me know, because I was unable. Instead, I just kind of took the potato mixture and mashed it into the bottom and the sides of a pie pan, and it is firm enough that you can kind of make a nice crimping on top. Then pour in your fake apple pie filling, level it off, and set it in the oven at 400 degrees Fahrenheit, 205 Celsius for 15 minutes, and then reduce the heat to about 350, 175 Celsius, and bake for another 15 to 20 minutes. After about 20 minutes, mine started to crack on the top, which I think means it's done. Not entirely sure, but that's when I took it out, and I did leave it to cool completely. And while your pie cools, you can thank your lucky stars, I know I did, that I was able to find that mention of prisoners getting pie, because you would not want to be eating what most prisoners during the Civil War were eating. Following the first major battle of the American Civil War, the First Battle of Bull Run, both Union and Confederate troops were taken prisoner by the opposing side and sent to prisons. At this time, these prisons tended to be well built with the infrastructure to handle and care for the inmates. Food at the time was also relatively good, because should you be entering prison with a bit of money in your pocket, then they usually had a setup where you could buy things like sugar and fresh vegetables and sometimes coffee and tobacco and just other things that you might want. Generally, enlisted men had 2 full meals a day and officers had 3 full meals a day. And those meals weren't extravagant, but they were hearty, usually some sort of bean or vegetable soup, and then a bit of meat, usually salted meat, but sometimes fresh meat, that had apple cider vinegar or other vinegar put on top of it to help prevent scurvy. At Fort Warren in Boston, prisoners received fresh beef with potatoes 3 times a week, salt beef, pork, and ham 3 times a week, and baked beans on Sundays. And this was in addition to tea, coffee, and over a pound of bread every day. The food we received at Johnson's Island was not, except at times, such as a prisoner had a right to complain of. Then, too, we were allowed to receive boxes of provisions under reasonable restrictions from our friends, and we received many such contributions. But should you not have any friends to send you these care packages or any money to buy extra food, your opinion of the cuisine might be a little bit different. For example, at that same exact prison, Johnson's Island on Lake Erie, another prisoner described the food, saying bread made of inferior flour, which was occasionally sour, was issued. The meat was rusty bacon or beef neck. Occasionally we had a few worm-eaten peas, and twice I saw some small potatoes. Rats were caught in and about the sinks and sold freely. The slop barrels were raked and bread crusts were fished out to be dried in the sun and eaten. Most of the accounts of decent food in the prisons came from early on in the war, and that's for a few reasons. One was that the food shortages hadn't really hit yet, and when they did hit, it was most definitely in the South first, and they had it the hardest. Another reason was that at the beginning of the war, there were just less prisoners, and as the war went on, the prisons began to fill up. In the first couple of years of fighting, there were actually periodic prisoner exchanges to keep down the prison population, and in July 1862, an agreement was signed that made it so prisoners on both sides would only be held for a few days before being paroled back to their own lines. But by midsummer of 1863, the whole thing had kind of broken down and the exchanges stopped happening as often. Now this of course led to the prisons becoming incredibly overcrowded, and this is when, instead of proper prisons meant to take care of people, both North and South built a number of what were essentially fenced-in tent cities. Two of the most infamous were New York's Elmira prison, nicknamed Elmira, and Georgia's Camp Sumter, better known as Andersonville. At Elmira prison, they opened before they were truly ready, and within a month of opening, they had over 12,000 prisoners, even though it was built to only house 4,000. Many slept outside with no blankets, and in some accounts, no clothing at all. This, of course, became a real problem when New York's winter hit. Hundreds of men froze to death. But, at least for that first winter, the food seemed to be okay. We entered the cookhouse by wards of 200 or 240 men. Soup was placed on long tables in mess pans. Bread and meat was served in the morning, bread and soup in the evening. Each man was obliged to furnish a vessel in which to carry his soup. In winter, on very cold mornings, what a sight we were, starting to the cookhouse for our food. We went in, old rags and strings and long unkept hair, dirt, cheekbones projecting, for there was very little of us except skin and bones. And as winter went on, the rations dwindled, and so eventually the Confederate prisoners were reduced to eating the rats that infested the prison. And when a rat would make an appearance, such a hurrah and such a chase and such a volley of stones. You would have thought it was our battalion of sharpshooters in a charge. Now down in Andersonville, they didn't have the New York winter to contend with, but they did have the Georgia summer, which is frankly just as bad in many ways. And instead of being 3 times capacity, the Andersonville prison was often at 8 times capacity, so men were just packed in there. Now, Andersonville is definitely the most infamous of the Civil War's prisons, and for good reason, because even at the best of times, life in there was hellacious. Our rations consisted of 10 ounces of hardtack full of worms, 2 ounces of salt beef, half a pint of beef soup, and half a pint of boiled rice. At one time, our bread ration was cut off and half a pint of mush made of spoiled cornmeal substituted. One of the men on one occasion picked 150 worms out of 3 rations of this meal. The rations were not sufficient to sustain life. And as I said, this was during the best of times. Really, the best time that you were going to have as a prisoner at Andersonville was when you first entered, because the guards would set up what they called the sutler's shop, where you could buy different goods, including different quality foods. And it was a way to give food to the new prisoners, but more so, it was a way for the guards to enrich themselves, because many of these prisoners from the North, they had greenbacks or Union money, as opposed to the Confederate money, which was all but worthless at this point. It was only going to get worse. So it was the guards' chance to get some of that quality money. Its goods were sold at incredible prices. A teaspoonful of salt, 25 cents. A small biscuit, 50 cents. Turnips, 25 cents each. Sweet potatoes, 25 cents each. And other things in proportion. The famished skeletons would stand around and look in on the good things, and consult their money, then their stomachs, and the money was turned over for the article. And just so you can get an idea of how much these things actually cost, that teaspoonful of salt that cost a quarter, well, that's about $5 in today's money. Now, life at Andersonville was truly intolerable. Most people were missing much of their clothing. Some people had no clothing. There was constant thievery and violence from the other inmates in the camp. And there was, of course, brutal violence from the Confederates who were guarding the camp. They actually set up a perimeter about 10 feet away from the stockade that surrounded the camp. They called it the deadline. And if you passed that, the guards would shoot you right then and there. Everyone was filthy, everyone had disease, and there was very, very little shelter. Most people dug out holes into the ground and just put some sticks or blankets over them. But when reading the diaries of the men who were imprisoned at Andersonville, you really get a sense that they were focused on food. Much of the misery that they went through came from a lack of food and clean water. But this lack of food was not always out of malice, but out of incompetence. See, for much of the war, the task of feeding the prisoners was part of the quartermaster department. But in February of 1864, the Congress of the Confederacy changed that responsibility over to the commissary department. But the commissary department was not ready to take on that responsibility really for like 5 weeks. And basically for that 5 weeks, no food went out. And even after that, they were playing catch up basically for the rest of the war. Now, after the war, Richard Winder, the officer in charge of feeding and sheltering everyone at the prison, claimed that there had been no disruption in rations and that the prisoners had received plenty of sweet potatoes, plus a pound of meal, a pound of potatoes, and a pound of beef or half-pound of bacon. And while that may sometimes have been true, it was definitely never the whole truth. For that, we need to look at the journals and diaries of the men who were in the prison. May 8th. Received a pound of bread today. The first we've had since we came here. 3 ounces of beef and a bucket full of rice to be divided among 90 men. How we wretches enjoyed it. The bread was made of yellow meal and somewhat resembled fruitcake, the flies taking the place of the raisins. That was Michael Doherty of the 13th Pennsylvania Cavalry, and his regiment was cornered during a battle, and 127 of them went down to Confederate prisons. 122 of them died at Andersonville, and 4 of them died at other prisons, leaving Michael Doherty to be the sole survivor of the 127 men from his regiment. And he cataloged everything that was taking place in a diary. Violence from the guards, violence from other inmates, and a complete lack of food. The rice we receive is hardly fit to eat because of so much handling and measuring. The men that have old tin cups are considered lucky, while others receive theirs on pieces of boards and in bags made out of pant legs and caps. Now imagine, if you can, the men eating that rice with a relish with their dirty black fingers. So much for starvation in the sunny South. Now, not having a tin cup might seem like a bit of a bother when you're getting corn or rice, but you also had to have something to carry the liquid rations that you were getting, like molasses or vinegar, which was really the only thing that was saving you from getting scurvy. And if you didn't have a cup or anything, you were holding that stuff in your hands. And even if you got your ingredients back to where you were at, you still usually had to actually do the cooking. And it was not easy to cook at Andersonville because very, very rarely did they actually get cooked rations. April 30th. They say we are going to get cooked rations soon. I hope we do, as wood and cooking utensils are scarce. We cook cakes on boards and lay them out in the sun until the water dries out of them. May 1st, Sunday rations, cornmeal, rice, and molasses. Fights all the time, day and night. May 2nd, pint of cooked rice and a gill of molasses for the next 24 hours. By that summer, the state of their rations had really gone to pot under the Georgia sun. Their meat was basically always rotten. As John L. Ransom recalled, the ham given us today was rotten, with those nameless little white things crawling around through it. And their cornmeal was very often nothing more than corn cobs that had been ground up. People were constantly dying of starvation and disease and a lack of water. They only had one water source, and it was a stream that ran through the center of the camp. And it was brackish and muddy water, and it was filthy because everything took place in that one stream. That's where people were bathing, that's where people went to the bathroom, and that's where people were getting their drinking water. So it's easy to see how Andersonville became the most infamous of the Civil War prisons. There were a lot of prisons that were terrible, but Andersonville usually gets pride of place. And part of that is because that was the one that was most publicized following the war. And it's also one of the only prisons where the people in charge, or one of the people in charge, was actually punished. It was the Commandant Henry Wirtz who was hanged in 1865. But no matter where you were, North or South, life as a POW during the American Civil War was absolutely hell. And that is why I am sure glad I was able to find that mention of making pie rather than making rations that would probably make me sick. Anyway, let's try that mock apple pie. And here we are, apple pie without apples from the American Civil War. So what's cool is that while this was baking, it actually smelled like an apple pie was baking in this house, which is so weird. So I sliced into it. As you can see, it holds together. It had to cool, but it holds together. The crust actually kind of puffed up, the potato crust. So, and it does look cooked through. Here we go. Wow. Okay. The texture is not that of apple pie. It's more like pumpkin pie, or, because it's like mashed up. But by golly, if it doesn't taste like apple pie, that's kind of weird. I mean, it's not exactly like apple pie, but almost. It's got to be that tartaric acid. I mean, that's the only ingredient in there that I can see. I don't know, that's kind of magical. Now I want to make the one that the Ritz company put out during the Depression, because I bet it's even better with Ritz crackers in there. Kind of adds that buttery flavor. And that's mighty, mighty good. So thank you again for getting the channel to 2.5 million subscribers. Thanks for watching me every Tuesday, or whenever you do tune in. How old am I? Tuning in. Anyway, I'll see you next time on Tasting History. I'm eating more of this pie. It's actually really, really good. That's so weird.